Dr. Peter Bartu will address resilience and innovation within the United Nations today. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Bartu. Peter Bartu is an international conflict prevention specialist with a long history of work in the United Nations. Bartu has extensive experience as a member of the standby team of the United Nations in 2011. Tasked to provide rapid and diplomatic responses to emerging conflicts. During his time on the team, Dr. Bartu has served in Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen, and among other hotspots. And most recently in Iraq, he advised the United Nations and Iraqi national leaders on a framework response to the recent political crisis within the government of Maliki. And as you know now, Dr. Bartu has a wealth of experience in the United Nations peacekeeping and peace building. He served as a political advisor to the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process based in Jerusalem. And he has worked as a foreign policy advisor in the Australian Prime Minister's Department. And in his early days, Dr. Bartu worked with the United Nations in East Timor and in Cambodia. And now he is involved in the Syrian conflict mediation process that is taking place currently. And during his free time, he teaches at UC Berkeley, teaches classes on the United Nations and also the Palestinian and Israeli and Palestinian conflict. And on behalf of United Nations Association East Bay, it is my honor and pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Peter Bartu.
Thanks for that generous introduction. I've had the pleasure of having quite extraordinary experiences with the United Nations for sometimes all the right reasons and sometimes all the wrong reasons. But I thought today, in talking to this question of resilience and adaptability, that if I spoke to you about some of my personal experiences in Cambodia, East Timor, the Middle East, Iraq, Libya, and now currently Syria, I would hopefully provide some insights that you might not have with some of these experiences, but also point to what it's really like in the field where I think all the important work really is as far as the UN is concerned. New York's important, but it's a long way away from just about anywhere, although it is obviously central with the Security Council and the UN Secretariat. I'd like to give you a little bit more insight about matters on the ground. So let me start first and foremost with describing how I got involved with the United Nations in Cambodia back in 1991, where as a young Australian who had just finished undergraduate studies in Southeast Asian studies, I studied Indonesian and Khmer as a language. And then in the late 1980s, the Australian Foreign Minister at the time, Gareth Evans, who along with Stephen Solarz, an American senator, had played a key role in helping negotiate the Paris Peace Agreements in 1991, which paved the way for a transition in Cambodia, whereby the Cambodian people, after almost 30 years of war, including genocide, would finally get the opportunity to choose their own leaders through a transition process overseen by the United Nations and leading to their first free and fair elections over an 18-month timeframe. Around this time, Australia was asked to provide a number of people to help with the UN mission, and so they did a quick head count in Australia of how many people actually spoke Khmer, and I think there were about 4 of us at the time. And as a consequence of speaking Khmer and having done some studies, I was asked to join as an interpreter and advisor at the age of 24-25 for the UN Force Commander, who was an Australian general in charge of 20,000 troops. And so for 2 years, I worked with him and also Yasushi Akashi, carrying bags, taking notes, writing diplomatic cables, participating in meetings with the Khmer Rouge, and all the Cambodian factions, travelling the length and breadth of the country, and basically having the most extraordinary experience that anyone could wish for in a lifetime, let alone as a 24 to 26-year-old. And Cambodia at this time, you can only imagine, after 30 years of warfare and the experience of Khmer Rouge and so on, was probably the poorest country I've ever seen in my life. And even with all of the travels that I've done subsequently through Africa and the Middle East, was probably the most broken country I ever saw then and have seen subsequently. In the dry season, whole villages were living off coconuts. Whole villages and districts and communities had actually been unexposed to the external world since the late 60s. So complete had been their quarantine and isolation through the war and so forth. And the UN did a great job. It helped organise elections, and the Hun Sen government won those elections and has more or less remained in power ever since. What does Cambodia tell us about 2-year transition periods in countries which are horribly broken and have to take their first steps moving forward? External agents like the UN can help with processes, they can help run elections, and they can help get the first steps happening. But external agents in and of themselves cannot, in very short periods, measured in months and years, change the essential political dynamics within a given community. You can come in with external assistance, external aid, you can help try and point the way, you can put the dynamics in abatement for a certain period, but to fundamentally change the underlying dynamics is very, very difficult. And so it's just put to you that by then a 26-year-old, I started to understand some of the limitations of external agents in trying to affect this change. And I'll come back to this point again shortly when I talk about Iraq. But if you go back to Cambodia today, you will see a dramatically changed country. In the last elections, last June national elections, through a process of elite miscalculation and hubris, and frankly the enfranchisement of many different constituencies within the country, the Hun Sen government, the ruling Cambodian People's Party, basically lost the election. And while they've clung to power until now, there's a democratic impulse that's in that country that I would argue goes back to those first elections back in 1993 that were run by the UN under circumstances of extreme argue where many UN staff were killed and where the UN held the line when everyone thought it would be a colossal failure. In 1999, I had the privilege then of going to East Timor, being one of the first UN staff members on the ground in May 1999, within days after the Portuguese government had signed an agreement with the Indonesian government where the Indonesians would allow a small UN group to come in to run a referendum by which the East Timorese people would choose to either remain within the Indonesian government as a province of Indonesia, or they would choose to separate and go their own independent way. Remembering that this was in a context where, after short-lived independence in 1975, Indonesia had invaded the country and then occupied it through until 1999. Indonesia would only agree to this process on the basis that it provided the security for the referendum through its police and military forces. And in passing, it also established a proxy militia working for its ends who tried to intimidate the local population into voting to remain with Indonesia. So over a process of about 4 months, I slightly, now I think at that time I was 34, slightly older and wiser, but again given ridiculous responsibilities to run a referendum in the west of the country, in the heartland of the militia and in the heartland of all the difficult areas. It became very clear to us prior to the conduct of the referendum that if the Timorese chose to separate, that their country would be destroyed. and this has been revealed in plans by the militia, plans by the Indonesian military, and so forth. So the UN, Ian Martin, who some of you have met, who I worked for at that time, went to Shenana Gusmao, the head of the figurehead of the East Timorese resistance, and said, look, if we run this thing, your country's going to be destroyed. Should we proceed or not? And Gusmao said, you have to proceed. So we did. And the people came out and voted 78% in favour of independence. And then, in a colossal spate of violence, the place was destroyed and many people were killed and so on and so forth. But it was a genuinely historic moment and a real act of self-determination for the people of East Timor. And I think the lesson there essentially is that sometimes there are historical turns where you just have to seize the moment. And despite the terrible cost, again, if you go to East Timor today, you'll see a thriving new country, new member of the United Nations system that is leading the way in a number of forums, including reframing the next round of development goals for the UN and for the global system, it having been a recipient of both good and bad advice and assistance from the UN in the past. So after that, I went to join the Australian Prime Minister's Department to work on foreign policy and multilateral issues, and began following the Middle East peace process on behalf of the Australian Prime Minister. And it became very clear as the Second Intifada was picking up steam in 2001 that things were not going very well after the failed talks in Camp David in 2000. So I was asked to go and join the office of Terry Ray Larson, the Norwegian envoy, who had been the architect, some of you may recall, behind the Oslo peace process, which began in '93, which it was hoped would lead to a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and a two-state solution under the formula of land for peace. This had not transpired. Second Intifada had begun, and I arrived 2 weeks after 9/11 into Jerusalem, literally into an environment where suicide bombers were going off every day through Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, and it led in due course to a major confrontation, an all-out war between the Israeli Defence Forces and the Palestinian Authority of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So I worked very intensely on that for 2 years with Larson, with the United States, with the government of Israel, with the Palestinians, in helping broker what became known as the Quartet Roadmap, which was still the basis for the talks today being held right now, but which was an effort to put all the issues on the table and point a way to resolution for that conflict. People often say, well, what role has the United Nations actually got in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process? This is a trifecta between Israel, the Palestinians, and the United States. No one else has got a role. Well, in fact, you'd be surprised. I could probably take it up in question time. But the UN is present on the Syrian border of the Golan Heights, on the border between Israel and Lebanon with UNIFIL. It also does all the heavy lifting with the Palestinian refugee problem both in Gaza, the West Bank and surrounding countries, and all of its agencies are present in Gaza and the West Bank in a way which provide a lot of assistance to the Palestinian people. And a presence, by the way, which is actually actively accepted and supported by the Israeli government, the Israeli Defence Forces, because if the UN was not there, someone else would have to pick up the slack in terms of providing that assistance, and it could fall away at the Israeli government. So in this very, very difficult environment, the UN is also very present and playing a key role. In 2008-2009, I was asked, after teaching here at Calfrey in 2007, was asked to go to Iraq to work on the Arab-Kurd dispute and lead a team of 15 researchers to write a big report and provide advice to Prime Minister Maliki and President Massoud Barzani of the Kurdistan Regional Government on how they could resolve their internal disputed boundaries and their land disputes, particularly Kirkuk in the centre, north centre of the country, which is an oil-rich province, which both the central government and the Kurdistan Regional Government claim as theirs. But it also includes a fault line of disputed areas running from the northwest on the Syrian border down to the southeast on the Iran border. So for approximately 15 months, my team and I, based out of Baghdad, travelled extensively to Kirkuk, Mosul, Diyala, Erbil in the north, spent days, weeks, months, Kurdish and Arab leaders, visited all the communities along this fault line, and came up with a 500-page report which we presented to both Maliki and Barzani, which to this day remains the basis for which they're going to eventually resolve that issue. The important thing here was that this was all in the context, of course, of a post-2003, or the 2003 invasion by the United States and the coalition with it. The UN had been sidelined and pushed out of any role there, but had been asked back by the United States in 2003 to help on the sidelines. You may recall that by 2006 and 2007 there was a raging civil war in Iraq. The United States was stretched, as was the coalition, in many directions in trying to manage that, put it down, channel it in some way, while at the same time another front was opening up with Arab-Kurd fighting up and down this fault line that I described in the disputed areas. The United States was stretched. It had basically promised the Kurds and the Arabs different things in relation to the disputed internal boundaries, and it was unable to act as a broker or mediator on this particular issue. And it was in this context that it asked the United Nations to come in and help it. I guess there are two things there. Again, there are times when the UN is needed and required, when much more powerful countries, for various reasons, are not able to play a role. And then the second issue I want to raise in relation to Iraq in general and overall, and it comes back to the point that I made about Cambodia in the United Nations in 1991 to 1993. What Iraq has shown us, and Afghanistan, as if we needed reminding, are the limitations of the military option and the militarisation of responses to issues of international peace and security. Granted, they're necessary sometimes, but you want to make sure you've got your national interests right, and you want to think through very carefully when you abandon collective responses to some of these issues and strike out on your own. But my point here, fundamentally, is the limitations of military options and militarisation in general in confronting some of these vexing issues. So, having spent 15 months on Iraq and returning there on occasion to sort of touch base and keep in touch with the principles on the Arab-Kurd issue, some of you would have come across this concept of preventative warning at least a decade ago, if not longer. It's been circulated, and it's not a new concept or new idea. But what the UN did, with some encouragement from some of the member states, particularly the Scandinavians and the Norwegians in particular, who were very supportive of this, was go through a process where on an annual basis they would recruit 5 or 6 people with different levels of expertise who would join the UN's Department of Political Affairs and be hired by them for a 1-year period, but would then work from home and would, as required, if there was a crisis, be called upon to then go wherever the crisis was and deal with it. The good news was, if there was no crisis, you could just stay at home and keep drawing your salary. And at the end of 2010, the global outlook seemed okay, and I thought this sounded like just the right job for me. And my family thought that would be a great idea too. I could just sit in the garage for 12 months and booked and plane and big husband again. And just as I sort of signed the dotted line, the Arab uprising, Arab Spring started. And my particular expertise has become and evolved over time, but for about a decade now, has been this question of political transitions and the steps that countries take to get back to constitutional government after they've had a crisis like a civil war, some challenge to constitutional order, or a coup or whatever. So literally, within days of the Libyan uprising in particular, I found myself in Benghazi, working with the rebel National Transitional Council through until the fall of Tripoli, on devising a transitional sequence whereby they would establish a transitional government and then work out their first elections, go through a national dialogue and constitution-making process, and then, based on that, have subsequent elections which would signify a return to constitutional order. And I've kept quite busy on that, doing similar advising with the Syrian opposition and also in talks with the people close to the Assad regime. And I guess just to quickly segue to Syria right now, which, like other countries in the Arab uprising, has been going since 2011 and getting worse and worse, I think, circumstances you're all aware of. The UN has been relentlessly engaged in every dimension of Syria. It doesn't receive the airplay and the same coverage that the Russia-US dispute receives, or how the domestic arguments are in Washington about whether the US should arm the rebels or not, or how the US should approach it. But basically, since day one, all of the UN and its agencies have been dealing with the horrendous refugee problem in Libya, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and also Egypt, where some of them have gone. Kofi Annan led the first effort to try and mediate a transition, which included 300 observers, which was a mission which fell apart in the context of the ongoing bloodshed. And Lakhdar Brahimi right now is in Geneva working with members of the opposition and the Assad regime to try and negotiate a transition through the horrendous mess that Syria currently is in. Once every decade and a half, I used to say once every decade, but I'm now saying once every decade and a half, there's a problem, a crisis like Syria which emerges, for which there's no solution in the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, there's going to be a lot more fighting before anything happens, mainly because it's a political football with the region and where the region, the lack of vision that the region has as to how it should proceed as it struggles broadly with the whole problem and challenge of electoral politics, democratic transition, which is amplifying a lot of the basic structural and sectarian ethnic differences across the region. But apart from the mediating side of things with Brahimi and the UN and the UN humanitarian agencies, you also have, out of the blue, as we saw last October, an extraordinary role for some right reasons, some wrong reasons, whereby the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, a UN agency only started in the mid-1990s, which has suddenly got a central role in getting rid of serious chemical weapons. And while that's certainly not the main issue here, it's an example of, rightly or wrongly, where the UN can also get involved. Just again on the Arab uprisings and these transitions in general, they're extraordinarily complex processes. First elections, national dialogues, constitution making, transitional governance are vexing questions. The UN has a lot of experience in these areas. It's been given a space and a role in many of these countries to provide advice and help out. again, a slightly different focus to just humanitarian health, education, and other issues that you're quite familiar with. I'd just like to finish, I think, with a sort of couple of comments about UN Quiet Achiever in the background, with a couple of other areas where it's been busy and not received much attention. World Food Programme has been in North Korea since 1995, consistently helping that country get through its mismanagement of its own food, various crises, has acted in an almost diplomatic role and a window for the rest of the world with that government, and deserves attention. The International Atomic Energy Agency has been a critical player in helping to resolve Iran's nuclear ambitions, and as part of the Joint Plan of Action agreed, the 6-month trial plan agreed last October. The IAEA inspectors are on the ground in Tehran today, making sure that Iran is keeping to its promises. I've mentioned the OPCW, and just in passing, in 3 other hotspots around the globe, or particularly Africa, at present, the Sahel area, the swathe of countries between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Horn of Africa, and also in East DRC, the UN is engaged with the EU, with the African Union, with the OIC, League of Arab States, other sub-regional organisations, in extremely innovative, complex ways: peacekeeping, mediation, Central African Republic, Mali, etc. Pulling its weight and doing its bit and working in a collaborative fashion in an extraordinary manner, which was just not present a decade ago and never seemed likely back then. But this is even this where it's on the front line. So, from my perspective, the UN's proved remarkably resilient, extraordinarily adaptable. We can always argue about whether it's adapting in the right way or the wrong way, but it is a fundamental part of international architecture, even perhaps if it may no longer be the central part. So with that, I'll conclude here, but I'll be delighted to take any questions. Thank you very much.
What is the relationship of people in the field with the Security Council each way? I mean, is the Security Council, or whoever, let's say, NAN or Bartu, are they telling you in the field, or are you getting information, and how do you give it back?
Sure, great question. If you asked me that in 1992, I would have given you a very grumpy answer to that question, because it was quite dysfunctional back then. These days, it's not. And the combination of technology, practice, and just much better oversight and communications in general means that field communications back to the Secretary General and to the Security Council is much, much better than it's ever been. So this has also been helped by, interestingly, a rise in the last decade in particular of a number of watchdog type civil society organisations which have been really keeping the Security Council quite honest. And I'm referring here particularly to a Security Council report, which is an organisation based out of New York, led by a former New Zealand ambassador, permanent representative to the UN. Colin Keating was found himself president of the UN Security Council in 1994 during the Rwanda genocide. And if any of you remember that issue, there was a lot of talk about, did Romeo Dallaire send the right cable back to UN headquarters about what was going to happen? How did Kofi Annan at the time, who was head of UN peacekeeping, respond to his request for more manpower to save the day? And Colin, quite scarred from that experience, decided that the Security Council could not get away without, needed some serious reform and transparency and openness and everything that it did. So he set up this organisation a decade ago, 2006 actually, and that's been publishing the agenda of the UN Security Council, writing position papers against all the issues that the Security Council does, and it's been a tremendous contribution. And this is on top of what I would call internal improvements through Department of Peacekeeping Operations, Department of Political Affairs, in making the organisation much more responsive.
Is that an NGO?
It is, yes, yeah. There, yeah.
Just a couple of questions. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the contractual agreement you were working on at the time when the Arab Spring came about. Very interested in that because, Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton kind of spearheaded that and wanted to see how things have gotten to kind of become parallel rather than perpendicular how it was at the time. And then, if you could, how do you feel about the AU sending persons from the African continent, from various countries in Africa, to participate in the rotations that are going on for the year-long term as members on the Security Council, and also maybe from Central South America, like countries like Brazil or Argentina, getting an opportunity to sit on the Security Council as well. Maybe possibly even turn it into something, because a lot of people are saying greater representation from those areas of the world coming about to maybe holding a permanent seat for each area, region of the world.
Yeah. The contractual arrangements were fairly straightforward with the United Nations to be on the standby team of mediators administered by the Department of Political Affairs for that period that you work for them. You're a UN expert consultant, and you're paid by them, and that's pretty much how it works. So hopefully that I can talk offline perhaps about how that might be more interesting or useful for you. But yeah, no, certainly, Security Council reform, this is one of those sort of not so good resilient examples. This is the kind of resilience you don't necessarily want, but it's the resilience that they're kind of forced to have. I think, every member of the United Nations does have the opportunity and has had the opportunity to participate on the Security Council pretty much without, obviously not having the veto power, but being able to participate, often in rotating circumstances for the particular geographical grouping which they're part of. Africa, of course, with 53 nations now, that's a lot of rotation to go through for an individual country to get on. But then, the question then becomes, who gets the permanent seat?
Right.
If it's a permanent seat, should it be rotated? If it's or should you give it to Nigeria? Should you give it to South Africa? Should you give it to Egypt? Should you give it to Kenya? What's the criteria basically? Population size of the economy, etc. So this
What
is
about a representative from the AU itself representing the entire continent?
indeed. And there's that would be a possibility, but then you would have the issue of how the AU could genuinely represent all of those interests. But it's a great, this is the nuts and bolts of it. So I'll give you an example. The European Union has an office in New York and is very good at mobilising, in the context of the UN General Assembly, common voting blocks from all of the European Union member countries.
Okay.
But it has no luck in getting a common position in the Security Council itself, where both France and the UK, while being members of the European Union, follow their own national interests on the Security Council. So great questions, but those two have not been resolved yet.
Thank you.
That one there, then this one, and that.
To me, it's amazing all the experience you have in this, and it's really good to hear the UN's role, because I don't think I always see that in the papers. But My question has to do with Syria, and kind of reflects back to your earlier comments on external, effect of external groups on an internal situation. And there was, forget her name, about a couple months ago, a Catholic nun who came out to speak, maybe you've heard about her, came out to speak all around the country. She came to Oakland about, well, her position was, even though she didn't like what Assad was doing, but she valued stability and was afraid of what would happen. I don't know. So it's interesting, the issue with the negotiations, I guess the stance that's taken by some that would have to be a complete transition, or, you know, it's very interesting. So I don't know if you want to comment on it.
No, I mean, that's an excellent question. I think for about at least half a year now, people have been, and when I say people, I mean, you know, folks in the American government, policy advisors in other countries saying, maybe it's better to go with the devil you know with Assad than to risk the possibility of a transition, which, by the way, there haven't been very good parallel, you know, any good examples in the region, which we can, you know, say this is, again, there's no guarantee in a transitional process. The problem, of course, there is what Assad and his government have done to the people of Syria is reprehensible. And there's the notion that the Assad government, and this is what they've got on the table in Geneva right now, is to the opposition, is you come and join us, we'll give you a few ministries, and then you fight the war on terror with us against Jabhat al-Nusra and some of these other groups, and we'll rebuild Syria together. Opposition leaders and members, if they can't do, I mean, they've got constituencies who find it unthinkable that anyone could work with Assad. So I just, but the most, so the question then becomes, what is the most stable option for a Syrian transition right now? And and having spoken to people close to the Assad regime and opposition figures on this, what everyone agrees on is this: Syria is broken and will never be the same again. They're never going to get back. And they want a peaceful Syria where everyone's allowed to return back home and participate in the country's future. What they want is advice on how to do that. Now, the advice they're getting, these are those who are not providing arms or support to one side or the other. The advice they're getting is to proceed very cautiously, to not throw oneself immediately into an electoral process or a constitution making or a national dialogue process which is not well thought through or deliberated. They've got issues right now, apart from, you know, transitional justice, revenge, the pain of what's happening day in, day out right now. They've got big internal arguments about the role of Islam in the future of their country, about what form of government they want, whether it's a presidential system or a parliamentary system, electoral processes, what type of elections should they be, national level, sub-national level, local level. Should the whole idea of a transition, with all its attendant risks, be delayed and the whole focus be on humanitarian and ceasefire, stop the fighting, and let's just build the country in a very decentralised way? Because we can see what happens a la Iraq, a la Lebanon, which has equivalent complexity in terms of ethnic and sectarian things. What happens if you rush these things? So all I can say is if people could stop the fighting and deal with humanitarian issues first, They are talking about all of the other issues, and they're very literate and understand what the pitfalls are. It's quite extraordinary how they are in this regard. But then, a third or another dimension rather is that there has to be a serious commitment from the regional players and the international players to stop sending weapons and to commit to the withdrawal and non-return of foreign forces from Syria. And we don't have that, whether it's Russia or Iran or Saudi Arabia and Qatar to a lesser extent. So the game is still being played in terms of balance of forces on the ground. But, I think that to sort of final comment about a very good question is there is a fundamental disagreement about Syria, and the fundamental disagreement is what is the most stable outcome. Some believe it should be built around Assad, some believe it can't be, and that's where we're at. Sorry, there was... ma'am, yeah.
I'm Veronica, and thank you for the work that you do. I'm Nigerian and American. American citizenship and Nigerian citizenship. So I'm talking from the perspective of Nigerian citizenship. Given the multiplicity of the tribal makeup of Africa, I think it would just be the best approach on the UN security question to have the East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, and North Africa represented. I think that would make sense so that issues are addressed from the needs of the different regions of Africa. Having just AU represent, I think, would be disservice to what's happening in Africa as a whole. Nigeria approaching the next highest GDP in Africa after South Africa should reflect a country where there's improvement of humanitarian rights, but it's really far from that. Given that it has that high GDP and most Nigerians still live under $1 a day with that amount of resources of every kind, from human, economic, environmental resources that Nigeria is blessed with. I wonder what you know about what United Nations is able to do, for example, in the upcoming elections in 2015. What tends to happen, and we read it, we feel like we're hostage to the Nigerian leadership, most of us in diaspora. And we also hear of United Nations going and observing elections and declaring it great. However, right under your nose, things are happening and they're never great. So what do you, given all the amazing work you've done, what can we at United Nations Association East Bay, what can we do with you? Because I'm in here, and I became a director today, and I'm really hoping that it's not just an association, but what can I do with the Nigerian population in diaspora to work with you and United Nations on ensuring that it's not the caricature that United Nations representatives see, because it's not, it was declared fair elections and it's absolutely far from the truth. And we crave for presence in the coming election. The PDP, which is the main party, has monopoly, and anyone who perceives or even thinks about running gets brutalized, gets they want to eliminate you, and we can just see that election being another caricature. I hope, with the amazing work that you've done and the presence that you have in the transformation, that there's any way that we can work with you to really ensure representation in the United Nations Security Council, and as well a presence of people who really know the internal, because you said people that are Americans, and we Nigerians feel like we need to be part of that process, and we can see through the gimmick that you can't see.
Great.
Could you repeat that facing the audience?
I think
we can echo what
there were two essential issues here. One was in relation to a regional approach in Africa to representation on the UN Security Council, which would more accurately reflect ethnicities, tribal groupings and so forth. Look, I think that's a terrific idea. And I just wanted to respond to that by saying that the regional groupings in Africa and the sub-regional groupings, Africa Union, ECOWAS, South African Development Community, EGAD, in the Horn of Africa, these are potentially the way of the future, essentially. And Nigeria has been the backbone of ECOWAS and has been leading regional responses, security, and mediation, I would argue, as well, in various countries, Mali and elsewhere. And it's a role that is being supported. So it would be great to have, a regional approach to representation on a reformed UN Security Council. But your second question, which is about the UN and other observer missions starting to get a bit pilloried, I would say, or not taken very seriously with how they are calling some of these election contests, which are not free and fair. And what the UN finds itself in a tricky situation here, because on the one hand, the UN Electoral Assistance Division in New York is actually one of the most operational and competent UN agencies, UN divisions in the whole Secretariat in New York. They've got some terrific people who are very experienced, who are on tap and on call and out in the field, running from one country to the next, providing technical advice to electoral commissions about how to run better elections. Now, one of the problems with that is that the UN, by doing so, is often trying to help out an electoral commission that's trying to do the right thing. But the electoral commission is working in an environment that is dangerous, where opposition parties are targeted, where the incumbent administration has complete control of all the resources, radio and airtime and commercial space and so forth. And the UN on the one hand is sort of giving assistance to what some would call a fundamentally flawed process, which is often applied to Nigeria and so on. And the UN's involved and finds it very hard to, in fact, it does not observe those operations where, the UN does not observe the operations where it gives technical assistance, because there's a fundamental conflict of interest. So when the UN is actually in a position where it's observing something, it's doing so on the basis that it's not giving technical advice, so it can actually be kind of impartial. But I would, what's stopping the UN Association of the East Bay from sending an election observation mission to Nigeria and being accredited with the Nigerian Election Commission and sending some members of the community here over there?
What's the justification for that?
Because you've got a director who's from Nigeria and is deeply interested in democratic processes there, and election observation and election work is fundamental to what the UN does.
Not UNA.
Sorry?
Not UNA. We're
Well,
UNA.
right, I'm just, then if on a corporate sense I can't answer that, I'm just saying, get an election observation mission accredited and do it.
Dr. Bartu,
Yeah.
sorry, just
Two
a
more
small
questions.
bit of a response, perhaps even taken and interpreted as rebuttal. But after having participated many years ago at Howard University on the model organization, the African Unity myself, and seeing it develop as it has into the AU housed in Ethiopia, it's an organization that is definitely developing, but an organization that needs to be listened to. And perhaps if the various regions of Africa would take that course of action, rather than insults being added to injury, and going ahead on peacefully speaking and peacefully collaborating with other regions on the continent, and then presenting their case by reason of due process peacefully to the representatives that are in the AU and allowing the AU to communicate that to the UN, then some things can go ahead on and get changed throughout the entirety of the country of Africa, as well as those regions that are still troubled to this day by that infighting that led a lot of them into the Atlantic slave trade by reason of having that problem of separation over to the Americas through the largest slave port here in our country, my home city of Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay, thank you. I think I've got two more here, so one there and one there. Yeah.
Without actually involving the United Nations in the local national politics of the United States, I knew, if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, that during the Libya revolution, the UN was at least a partner in planning and seeing that some changes occur in Libya. Now, I'm very much interested to find out what the third party's point of view is about what happened to Benghazi. We lost a favorite son, Chris Stevens of Piedmont, lost his. And seemingly there is an inevitability of Hillary running as the president of the United States. And which makes us question whether in her watch, she was the person in charge for the department. Is she in fact a very strong person in diplomacy but weak in security? We need to get an idea of just what the third party's opinion might be about Benghazi and Libya.
Okay, very good. Yes, no, Chris Stevens is a personal friend of mine, so it wasn't just Piedmont we lost him, I can assure you. We worked together in Jerusalem and also in India, me for the UN and the US. And he's a wonderful diplomat and a very good friend. There's the Senate Committee, the Intelligence Senate Committee, I think it is, only last week released its final report on culpability for what happened in Benghazi in September 2012. And basically, the security arrangements were lax in Benghazi at that time. And there was a sense, I think, by people on the ground that the goodwill generated around US support for the Libyan revolution was essentially such that they didn't need additional security measures. Certainly the security measures that were prevalent in Benghazi at the time of the attack when the ambassador died were at a much lower level than you would see at an American consular or embassy location in many other parts of the globe. So, it was tragic too, in the sense that the report, which sought to depoliticise the issue as much as possible, did seem to show a link between the video that was made insulting Islam and the Prophet Muhammad, which had created a reaction in the crowd in Cairo in front of the embassy, then got picked up by fundamentalist groups in Benghazi, who then went and did their own demonstration, which went horribly wrong, which led to the death of the ambassador. This seems to be the prevalent reading rather than an Al-Qaeda plotted and planned arrangement sometime in advance. So my point here being, there was no video and there was no demonstration in Cairo. The ambassador could well have just had a regular routine meeting in Benghazi and gone back to Tripoli, where there were regular security arrangements. So it seems to me a tragic combination of events that will basically have the impact of driving American diplomats into tighter security arrangements where they're further removed from the local populations, which is not what you want to be doing, but that's a reality. And you have to do a risk assessment on this. But I mean, to blame this on Hillary Clinton, to blame this on anybody, I think is taking the wrong approach.
Last question.
Sorry, ma'am. Okay. So,
When you get to a conflict spot, how do you identify the actors who will sit at the table to resolve it? I mean, I know someone in my family has been killed. I will be very disappointed if some member of my family is not on the table.
that's a great question. I'll just answer that very quickly. In Syria right now, there are more than 4,000 discrete militias that form part of the opposition. Now, I don't know who should be invited to the table out of all of those, but that just gives you a sense of the degree of incoherence, particularly with that conflict. And it is the prevailing question in any, conflict which you're trying to resolve. Ma'am, the last one.
Yeah. First, a short comment on that, and then my question. We'll never know. Can you hear me? We'll never know who is the provocative agent that puts a story on the internet that's harmful or demeaning of the Muhammad. And so we don't know what the causative forces are, and we're sort of behind the eight ball. So who did it? Who started this thing rolling? We don't know. It could be that forces that want to see the trouble that's fomented by that are ready to move in after they've stirred up ill feelings. Here's another question, more organizational, and that is that in the last couple of months, the United Nations peacekeeping forces have been used on one side of a conflict. This is, to me, earth-shaking. And I think there was one large story in the New York Times on it, and otherwise it's going down. Now the UN does not participate in taking sides. Wouldn't go with the US and NATO when the US and NATO bombed Kosovo, for example. So we've had a change, apparently, of how the UN Charter is being read. Can you comment on where is it all coming from, and where can we get hold of it?
Yes. The UN peacekeeping is moving into a warfighting mode of operation in a number of parts of Africa right now.
DRC.
Eastern DRC being the obvious example where there's a special intervention brigade of, I think, Angolans, Tanzanians, and one other country, approximately 1,700, is the size of the Amazon forest. Okay, so just put that into perspective first. It is absolutely a departure from how the UN peacekeepers have been utilised in the past. Not a complete departure. And interestingly enough, one could make the argument that the UN peacekeepers in the Congo in the 50s, when Dan Hammarskjöld got killed, were engaged in a similar warfighting way. But it's true, the whole peacekeeping doctrine is under is changing quite rapidly. I'm not sure it's being thought out very, very clearly. The genealogy of this intervention brigade in Eastern Congo goes back at least a decade of the UN and the DRC authorities' failure to restore law and order in Eastern Congo. The role of Rwanda and Uganda has been particularly troublesome in that regard. So it's not just the UN and the DRC authorities' fault necessarily. But this intervention brigade has come out of a degree of frustration and has been not just thought of in and of itself, but has been pulled together in the context of what is hoped to have been and what is hoped to be right now a proper regional approach to that part of the Congo. By that I mean Rwanda, interference and in that area. And it's in that context where the UN, DRC authorities in these neighbouring states are being asked to work together. So whether it works, it's too early to tell, but it's new ground. And it's not just there either, by the way. It's also in Somalia with AMISOM, African Union Mission in Somalia, UN advisors there. It's also in Mali, where you had a handover from ECOWAS to the French, back to ECOWAS, and now ECOWAS, the AU and the UN, working with the French in supporting that transition. And there are a number of demands, again, with AU and the UN and France with Central African Republic as well. But it's a new, there was a time when there was no peace to keep, the UN would not go there. i.e. You'd make the peace agreement or the deal first, and then you'd have peacekeepers go in there and oversee the process and make sure everyone kept up their promises. What we're seeing now is people going in before an agreement has been reached. Least of all with agreement for people on the ground. So it's a very complex evolution, and I have my doubts. But again, this is in the context of deep frustration with ineffectiveness before they got to that point. Doesn't mean they're going the right way.